thing, but I don't know. I think there's something. There's something there. I don't know. Awesome. So, okay, so something happened very recently, and I would love for you to talk about why this was such a big deal, and really bring to light because I think what happened gives wildlife photography and wildlife photographers a very bad rep. And so I know you know what I'm talking about. And if you want to go ahead and say what happened, um, and what should have been done differently, and how we can help prevent things like this in the future, because I mean, this show is Rewildology. The last thing we want to
Mhm,
do is take a wild animal and make it not wild. So let's
mhm.
talk about what happened.
Yeah, and let me just say that I love the name Rewildology because you're. I mean, the way I interpret that title is just like let's turn this planet wild again, and
Yep.
that's exactly what I'm trying to do, and exactly what this event relates back to. So I think we're seeing a shift in wildlife photography from kind of like the old ways and how a lot of famous wildlife photographers became well known in a world without social media, without public accountability. Photographers like Tom Eggleston, Paul Nicklin, David Yarrow, um, who became really successful because of solely one thing: beautiful images of animals, right? And there's no denying that these photographers get beautiful images of animals. The question then is how these images are captured. So to kind of run you guys through what happened, 2 weeks ago, um, there's an area here in the park called Coulter Bay where it's known to have a lot of foxes. And so I sent my friend Tiffany Taxis on Instagram out there because she's getting into wildlife photography here. She just graduated from college in Florida and has been falling in love with the region. Um, and sent her out there. I was like, hey, you should go. There's been some foxes out there. Just go check it out. So she goes and she basically what happened that day is she was around some foxes. She was around a fox and started taking pictures of it from a distance. And um, maybe 50 to 100 yards away out on the frozen lake, there was a stylized shoot going on. A bunch of like Western outfits, and she didn't pay much attention to it. She thought it was a little weird, but she didn't pay much attention to it. And eventually, she started noticing this fox making its way towards one of the crew members of this party. And a second fox showed up and noticed that there was a man, who I'll talk about later, dropping food from a plastic bag. And then the foxes made their way obviously closer to the food. And eventually, the photographer who wrapped up his stylized shoot laid on the ground, and the man started rustling a bag and dropping items from behind the photographer so as to lure the foxes in towards the photographer so he can get a really close, wide angle shot of a beautiful animal. Um, and so she, kindly asked them to let the animals interact naturally because there were two foxes and it's breeding season, or mating season. So um, she wanted to see these foxes interact, because you could see some phenomenal interactions between two foxes playing, fighting, mating, doing their thing, and she wanted to capture that. And instead, these guys were baiting these animals with food, and she was basically shut down and ignored. These guys didn't respond, and one of the guys who was at the incident, who was the guide in this situation, or we later found out, said the words to the fox, said to the fox, "You better do what we tell you to, or else I'll take out my shotgun and shoot you." And Tiffany took that as a low key, it's kind of a threat, indirect threat, like, "Hey, we have a gun, just like get your shots and leave," kind of thing. And so she left, and she called me on the way home, in tears, in shock. She's like, "What just happened? Like, there are these guys, and like, they were baiting them, and then they like threatened the fox with a gun. Like, who would do such a thing? Blah blah." She had no idea who this was. She was just like, "I'm like, did you get any pictures?" She's like, "Yeah, I did. The only name I heard was David." And so I was like, interesting, because I know that the famous photographer David Yarrow is in town right now, and he has an existing bad rep for using unethical practices such as game farms, where wild animals such as cougars and or mountain lions, however you want to refer to them as, and wolves and a bunch of other predators are kept in terrible conditions solely to be used for photo shoots. And he was recently exposed 3 months ago for engaging in some extremely unethical practices around wild African elephants, which endangered both the lives of his models and the elephants. And so I was like, could it be? And so we looked it up, and sure enough, it was David Yarrow. And so, a lot of people are injecting doubt into this conversation because they're like, oh, well, like, she has the incentive to like take him down. And the fact is, she had no idea who this was. She was going to report this incident no matter what. And it just so happened to be a photographer with almost 500,000 followers on Instagram, who's made a killing selling prints. Someone who could be such a powerful voice in conservation. And so, what's wrong with that? A lot of people, I get a lot of messages on Instagram, like, what is wrong? Like, I got an honest question, like, hey, dude, like, maybe I'm just stupid, but like, what's the problem with feeding wild foxes? And like, I just think we live in a world so disconnected from the wild and from, nature, that like people don't know these things, and it's okay. We just have to educate them. And so, what's wrong with that is that when you feed a wild animal, like a fox, you are habituating them, conditioning them to being fed by humans. It's called food conditioning. And I want to strike an important difference between food conditioning and human habituation. Animals being used to being around humans is not necessarily a bad thing if they do not associate humans with food, if they just see them as humans. Now, where it gets slippery is where animals start relying and associating humans to food. And so, there's a quote that goes, "A fat animal is a dead animal,"
which is
um,
beyond true.
right? So, like, in the most obvious example of why it's bad to feed an animal is with a bear. If a bear gets into human food and gets used to being fed human food, anytime he sees a human, he's going to think, I'm getting fed. And if he doesn't, he might have adverse reactions. He could hurt someone. He could hurt himself. He could hurt his young ones by getting too close to roads, et cetera, et cetera. With a fox, it's the same thing. Obviously, it's not a bear. It's not going to like eat someone, but a fox could bite someone. A fox could get killed on the road. It could put its little ones in danger. Same kind of reasoning. And so to see a famous wildlife photographer engage in such blatant malpractice is so disheartening, because you can get such incredible photos without doing these things. And,
Which you've shown.
Thank you so much. And so this was a really concerning event, and it's still ongoing. We have a petition online. It's a Linktree. It's Linktree/Advocate for Wildlife. Petition to get David Yar banned from all national parks. We have several news media outlets covering the story. David Yar has, of course, denied that he was feeding the foxes. He said that he was dropping snow, while his fixer, Rosie, who was the one dropping the food, claimed that he was dropping cigarette paper, which their stories don't match up. If you were dropping cigarette paper, that's littering in a national park. And regardless of what you're dropping, you're still baiting the animal one way or another. The thought process behind the psychology in the animal is the same, where it's associating getting closer to humans for what it thinks is food or whatever, And so, unfortunately, very sadly, 2 days ago, this fox was put down. This was a fox that had already been fed. It was already being targeted by the Park Service because it was already, you know, very habituated and food conditioned. And it's just such a shame that the last straw comes at the hands of a wildlife photographer of all people. You know, you would think it would be Florida man or
Yeah,
something.
some person who's
Um,
completely ignorant that it's the tourists that feed animals, with this is a very big
right,
problem. But
right,
at least they have ignorance. Like at least they're naive.
right.
Like
So, kind of to the point of this story is like, I think there is a collective shift happening right now in the wildlife photography community away from these sort of ancient ways. And I'm not here to roast any famous wildlife photographers, but the truth is a lot of these famous wildlife photographers, Tom Mangelson, Paul Nicklin, David Yarrow, have engaged in unethical practices. Um, you know, Tom Mangelson has engaged in game farms. Um, I don't know any details on Paul Nicklin, but I wouldn't doubt that he's done some shady shit. Um, you know, and I think it's a really great time to be in wildlife photography because there's this collective shift happening, and I think there's a ton of awesome, passionate, conservation focused, ethical wildlife photographers out there, and I named some of them at the beginning of this episode: Brooke and Savannah and Peter, and there's a ton of them, and I think um, together we are stronger. I think as a wildlife photography community, we have the power to make profound changes. You know, someone I look up to a lot for that is Drew Hamilton, who I touched on earlier in this episode, um, who has been instrumental in the fight against Pebble Mine, which is an ongoing fight. And I think it's an exciting time because we're sort of, you know, putting the oldies to rest, so to say, and putting these antiquated practices to rest, and setting a new standard out there. And through that, and I think through social media and through public accountability and through continuing to inspire people through powerful images and videos of wildlife, we'll be able to achieve a new higher standard and inspire more people towards conservation, inspire more people to reconnect with the wild, and to fall in love once again with the wild.
that was a perfect recap of that. And I did not know that that fox was put down. But
2 days ago, that's really sad. Yeah, they published an article yesterday.
which that is the perfect example. I mean, that is the example of a fed animal as a dead animal. Having studied carnivores and predators so long myself, that is a major problem and one of the biggest issues of or like reasons for human wildlife conflict is because these I mean it's not normally, but it's quite often, you know, like a predator or something that has an actual dangerous, just being in its presence can be dangerous. Because you know, even a fox, you're like,
Mm-hmm.
oh, it's just a little fox. Well, one, those can
Mm-hmm.
bite people. Those can take, you know, domestic pets. Like there's a
Mm-hmm.
lot of cascading effects, even with just something as tiny as a fox. It gets way scarier, way hairier when we're talking about tigers, when we're talking about bears, when we're talking about these other creatures where there's, I mean, like for example, you know, in Asia and stuff, like they have to remove man eating tigers, like that exists. That's a thing.
Mm-hmm.
And so just bringing this more to light of why a fed animal is a dead animal, and the more people that travel around, I hope they get this message that do not litter, do not do anything to bait an animal, do not do, I mean, because even like for example, Lee and I, one Christmas, we were staying in Grand Lake, you know, on the other side of Rocky
Mm-hmm.
Mountain National Park. And there was this fox that kept coming around town. And the locals were like devastated, sad about this fox because when the tourists were in town for the summer, they would always feed it. And so this fox was completely food conditioned to be in Grand Lake, but the locals knew better. So
Mm-hmm.
whenever, then it would just stay around the wintertime and would stay around the people thinking it was going to get fed. So it completely lost its natural abilities to be a wild fox because it was so food
Mm-hmm.
conditioned to all the tourists that were in town. And they were
Mm-hmm.
devastated. I don't know, that fox probably still isn't alive, I would imagine. But that is a perfect example of just 2 days ago that this fox had to be put down. um,
Mhm.
because of ignorant people not letting the wild be wild. And just like you
Mhm.
said, that's what the show is all about. Let's keep things wild, keep these things pristine and beautiful, and do what we can to protect it. So, yeah, I'm really glad that you
Yeah, I think it's you kind of hit the nail on the head there. It's about keeping things wild. Wild animals are as cute as they might be, you know, they are wild, and it's important that we treat them as so, and we respect that, and we give them all the distance they need when we're around them. That we don't interfere with their routines in any way. I think that's something people don't really think about. And again, to really drill this point home, because I think it's important to distinguish once again between food conditioning and human habituation. You have food conditioning, um, which we've explained pretty well, versus human habituation, such as the bears in Katmai National Park, who are so used to seeing humans but have never associated them with food. And in all of the history of this national park, I don't think there's been a single attack from a brown bear on a human, even though these bears are constantly around humans all summer long. And I think that's really an important distinction to make that people don't really think about. They're like, oh, well, they're used to being around humans nonetheless. It's like, yes, but are they food conditioned? It's like if you hand feed a moose. I heard a story about a lady that hand fed a moose in Canada or something, and that moose had to be put down because like more people get attacked from moose every year than bears. Surprisingly enough, a lot of people don't know that, but yeah, it's really important to keep that distinction between human habituation and food conditioning, um, which is why using bird feeders is okay, or like dumping roadkill at a dump site for wolves to come find later is okay because they're not associating that with humans. Um, but yeah, yeah. Thank you for bringing that up. That's a really important topic right now. It's an ongoing fight. Once again, it's the link tree is /advocate for wildlife. We're doing everything we can to collect petitions to um, ban David Yarrow from national parks, so that at least if he keeps getting pictures using game farms, we know where he's getting his photos. But we can't have that kind of behavior in national parks here. Um, you know, he's bound to hurt more animals at this rate.
and just also to people who aren't as in the know as your friend. Like, thank God it was her that saw it.
Mm-hmm.
You know what
Oh
I
yeah.
mean? Like, it could have been any, I mean, luckily right now, this is not the Taurus season up in Yellowstone, but I mean, it could have just been like a random tourist that have been like, hey, that's kind of weird. I don't know what they're doing, but meh, I'm just going to go on and find something else to go look at. But it was her that captured the moment and knew that how wrong it was, especially like
Mm-hmm.
a pretty serious threat on top of that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
gosh, I'm so glad she got a hold of you. And there's also one more thing that I want to say about human habituation, because I think that some people might, if they've seen any photos of like gorilla treks and stuff. So,
Mm-hmm.
in a lot of those situations where animals have been intentionally human habituated, those are done by like extremely trained teams that are scientists that
Mm-hmm.
know these animals. Like, they know these animals so well, their biology, their behaviors, how to handle themselves, um, that it's remarkable. It's remarkable. And while you were talking about that, I was thinking about the gorillas the whole time. Um, and that being a perfect example of doing it properly. These animals have never been, they do not associate, food with humans. I don't even think you can have anything other than water on you when you're doing like the gorilla treks or, other wildlife type encounters. And the rules are insanely strict on these kinds of places where you do have an opportunity to see wildlife a little bit closer up for animals that have been human habituated that aren't in a captive setting. So I also want to like throw that in there as well, because I'm sure that people have probably seen some photos of
Mm-hmm.
humans with gorillas in the wild. And it's
Mm-hmm.
like, well, what is that about? And that's a great example of it being done the right way, and why it's so
Yeah.
goddamn expensive to go on a gorilla trek because those things are protected, and that trek money goes to saving those gorillas that you're going to go see. And then, of course, the wild groups are kept wild. You know, there's somewhere else. There's only a few
Yep.
selected groups of habituated animals. So I did want to just throw that out there as well.